Angels! Welcome back for another Mathinic episode.
This is Teacher Mika.
And this is Teacher Joyme.
Today, we will learn about estimating the square roots of whole numbers and plotting irrational numbers. Excited na ba kayo?
Before we start, kindly prepare your self-learning module, your pen, and paper to write your solutions and answers as we progress with our discussion.
Also, look for a place in your home where you feel comfortable and safe. And most importantly, prepare yourself to watch and listen carefully.
After going through this module, you are expected to
estimate the square root of a whole number to the nearest hundreds
and plot irrational numbers or square roots on a number line. Last week, you have learned about principal roots and irrational numbers. Now, let's check your prior knowledge. Find the principal root of each number and tell whether it is rational or irrational. For letter A, square root of 25. For letter B, square root of 64. For letter C, square root of 169. For letter D, square root of 77. For letter E, square root of 444. We will give you time to answer this.
Let's check your answers. Sa letter A, ang principal root ng square root of 25 ay 5, which is rational. Sa letter B, ang principal root ng square root of 64 ay 8, which is rational. Sa letter C, ang principal root ng square root of 169 ay 13, which is rational. Sa letter D, ang 77 ay hindi perfect square. Kaya ang principal root ng square root of 77 ay between 8 and 9. At kung gagamit or gumamit ng calculator, ang sagot ay 8.774964 and so on, which is irrational. At sa letter E, ang 444 ay hindi perfect square. Kaya ang principal root ng square root of 444 ay between 21 and 22. At kung gumamit ng calculator, ang sagot ay 21.071307 and so on, which is irrational. I hope you get all the answers right. From the activity done, you were able to name two consecutive integers where the square root of an irrational number lies. But how about if you are asked to find the estimate value of the given square roots that are not perfect squares without using a calculator? What are you going to do? You will find this out in this lesson, which is estimating the square roots of whole numbers to the nearest hundreds. Kung matatandaan ninyo sa ating previous video, sinagutan natin ang table ng perfect square integers. Ngayon, sabay-sabay nating i-recite ang perfect square integers from 1 to 15. 1 squared is 1 times 1, which is equal to 1. 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is equal to 4. 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is equal to 9. 4 squared is 4 times 4, which is equal to 16. 5 squared is 5 times 5, which is equal to 25. 6 squared is 6 times 6, which is equal to 36. 7 squared is 7 times 7, which is equal to 49. 8 squared is 8 times 8, which is equal to 64. 9 squared is 9 times 9, which is equal to 81. 10 squared is 10 times 10, which is equal to 100. 11 squared is 11 times 11, which is equal to 121. 12 squared is 12 times 12, which is equal to 144. 13 squared is 13 times 13, which is equal to 169. 14 squared is 14 times 14, which is equal to 196. And lastly, 15 squared is 15 times 15, which is equal to 225.
Pansinin na kapag naghahanap tayo ng square root of a perfect square number, ang sagot ay whole number. Sa kabilang banda, kapag naghahanap naman tayo ng square root ng isang number na hindi perfect square, ang sagot ay meron kasamang decimal places.
Let's have some examples. Estimate each square root to the nearest hundreds. Letter A, square root of 7. Letter B, square root of 44. Letter C, square root of 125. Letter D, square root of 263. And letter E, square root of 73. Obviously, ang mga example na ito ay hindi perfect squares. Ngayon, hahanapin natin ang estimated value ng kanilang square root using a series of estimation. Note na ang place value ng first digit pagkatapos ng decimal point ay tinatawag na tenths. Ang next place value naman after tenths ay hundreds.
Iisa-isahin natin ang mga ito. Example letter A, square root of 7. Since 7 is not a perfect square, ibig sabihin, ang square root niya ay may decimal places. So, step 1, we need to find the two perfect squares closest to 7. They are 4 and 9. Because square root of 7 is greater than square root of 4 but less than square root of 9. Or, square root of 7 is greater than 2 but less than 3. Gumamit tayo ng less than at greater than to represent that square root of 7 is less than 3 but greater than 2. Therefore, square root of 7 lies between 2 and 3. And since 7 is closer to 9 than 4, we know that square root of 7 is closer to 3 than 2. Step 2. Make an educated guess to one decimal place and try it. Since we know that square root of 7 is closer to 3 than 2, we then square numbers closer to 3 with one decimal place. Note that squaring 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4 ay hindi na kailangan kasi malayo na ito sa 3. Kaya magsisimula tayo sa 2.5 squared, which is 6.25. 2.6 squared is 6.76. 2.7 squared is 7.29. And 2.8 squared is 7.84. Square root of 7 lies between 2.6 and 2.7. Step 3. Decide which is closer. Since 7 is closer to 6.76 compared to 7.29, we will now use 2.6, then estimate further by squaring the numbers. 2.61 squared is equal to 6.8121. 2.62 squared is equal to 6.8644. 2.63 squared is equal to 6.9169. 2.64 squared is equal to 6.9696. 2.65 squared is equal to 7.0225. Note that squaring 2.66, 2.67, 2.68, and 2.69 ay hindi na kailangan dahil ang square root of 7 ay mas malapit sa 2.6 than 2.7. Notice that 7 is closer to 7.0225 compared to 6.9696. Meanwhile, 7.0225 is the square of 2.65. Hence, square root of 7 is 2.65 when estimated to nearest hundreds.
Example B. Square root of 44. Step 1. Since hindi perfect square ang 44, hanap tayo ng dalawang perfect squares na pinakamalapit kay 44, which is 36 and 49. So we have now square root of 44 is greater than square root of 36 but less than square root of 49. Kung mapapansin ninyo, nasa gitna ng square root of 36 at square root of 49 ang square root of 44. Therefore, extracting the square roots, ang square root of 44 ay nasa gitna ng 6 at 7. Since mas malapit si 44 kay 49, gagamitin natin ngayon ang 10th decimal place na mas malapit kay 7. So we will start with 6.5 squared is equal to 42.25, which is still far from 44. 6.6 squared is equal to 43.56, which is closer to 44. 6.7 squared is 44.89, which is already exceeded 44. Now, pipili tayo between 43.56 and 44.89. Alin ang mas malapit sa 44? Very good! Mas malapit ang 43.56 kaysa sa 44.89. So we will choose 6.6 for further estimation on hundredths place. Let's start with 6.61 squared, which is 43.6921 and closer to 44. Next, 6.62 squared, which is 43.8244, which is very close to 44. 6.63 squared, which is 43.9569, again, very close to 44. And lastly, 6.64 squared, which is 44.0896, which already exceeded 44. Notice that 44 is closer to 43.9569 compared to 44.0896. Meanwhile, 43.9569 is the square of 6.63. Hence, the square root of 44 is 6.63 when estimated to nearest hundreds.
Example C. Square root of 125. Step 1. Since hindi perfect square ang 125, hanap tayo ng dalawang perfect squares na pinakamalapit kay 125, which are 121 and 144. So we have now square root of 125 is greater than square root of 121 but less than square root of 144. Kung mapapansin ninyo, nasa gitna ng square root of 121 at square root of 144 ang square root of 125. Therefore, extracting the square roots, ang square root of 125 ay nasa gitna ng 11 at 12. Since mas malapit si 125 kay 121, gagamitin natin ngayon ang tens decimal place na mas malapit kay 11. So we will start with 11.1 squared, which is 123.21, and that is still far from 125. Next, 11.2 squared, which is 125.44, which already exceeded 125. Now, pipili tayo between 123.21 and 125.44. Alin ang mas malapit sa 125? Very good! Mas malapit ang 125.44 kaysa sa 123.21. So we will choose 11.2 for further estimation on hundredths place. Let's start with 11.15 squared, which is 124.3225, and that is closer to 125. Next, 11.16 squared, which is 124.5456, and that is closer to 125. Next, 11.17 squared, which is 124.7689, and again, that is closer to 125. 11.18 squared, which is 124.9924, which is very close to 125. And lastly, 11.19 squared, which is 125.2161, which already exceeded 125. Notice that 125 is closer to 124.9924 compared to 125.2161. Meanwhile, 124.9924 is the square of 11.18. Hence, square root of 125 is 11.18 when estimated to nearest hundreds.
Example letter D. Square root of 263. Step 1. Since hindi perfect square ang 263, hanap tayo ng dalawang perfect squares na pinakamalapit kay 263, which are 256 and 289. So we have now square root of 263 is greater than square root of 256 but less than square root of 289. Kung mapapansin ninyo, nasa gitna ng square root of 256 at square root of 289 ang square root of 263. Therefore, extracting the square roots, ang square root of 263 ay nasa gitna ng 16 at 17. Since mas malapit, ang 263 sa 256, gagamitin natin ngayon ang 10th decimal place na mas malapit kay 16. So we will start with 16.1 squared, which is 259.21, and that is still far from 263. Next, 16.2 squared is 262.44, and that is closer to 263. And lastly, 16.3 squared, which is 265.69, and that is already exceeded 263. Now, pipili tayo between 262.44 at 265.69. Alin ang mas malapit sa 263? Very good. Mas malapit ang 262.44 kaysa sa 265.69. So we will choose 16.2 for further estimation on hundredths place. Let's start with 16.21 squared, which is 262.7641, and that is close to 263. 16.22 squared, which is 263.0884, and that is a little more than 263. Notice that 263 is closer to 263.0884 compared to 262.7641. Meanwhile, 263.0884, which is the square of 16.22, hence, the square root of 263 is 16.22 when estimated to nearest hundreds.
And for our last example, square root of 73. Step 1. Since hindi perfect square ang 73, hanap tayo ng dalawang perfect squares na pinakamalapit kay 73, which are 64 and 81. So we have now square root of 73 is greater than square root of 64 but less than square root of 81. Kung mapapansin ninyo, nasa gitna ng square root of 64 at square root of 81 ang square root of 73. Therefore, extracting the square roots, ang square root of 73 ay nasa gitna ng 8 at 9. Since mas malapit ang 73 sa 81, gagamitin natin ngayon ang 10th decimal place na mas malapit kay 9. So we will start with 8.5 squared, which is 72.25, and that is closer to 73. Next, 8.6 squared, which is 73.96, which already exceeded 73. Now, pipili tayo between 72.25 at 73.96. Alin ang mas malapit sa 73? Very good! Mas malapit ang 72.25 kaysa sa 73.96. So we will choose 8.5 for further estimation on hundredths place. Let's start with 8.51 squared, which is 72.4201, which is closer to 73. Next, 8.52 squared, which is 72.5904, which is closer to 73. Next, 8.53 squared, which is 72.7609, and again, that is closer to 73. 8.54 squared, which is 72.9316, and that is very close to 73. And lastly, 8.55 squared, which is 73.1025, which already exceeded 73. Notice that 73 is closer to 72.9316 compared to 73.1025. Meanwhile, 72.9316 is the square of 8.54. Hence, square root of 73 is 8.54 when estimated to nearest hundreds.
Congratulations! You just finished the first part of our lesson. You can now answer what's more on page 12, what I have learned on page 13, and what I can do on page 14.
You have learned in the previous lesson on how to estimate square roots of a whole number which are not perfect squares. But what about if you are asked to plot the square roots on a number line? How are you going to do this? We will talk about that in this lesson. Plotting irrational numbers on a number line. But before we proceed, let's have a brief review. Name the two consecutive integers between which the given square roots lie. Letter A, square root of 2. Letter B, square root of 7. Letter C, square root of 28. Letter D, square root of 150. And letter E, square root of 41. I will give you time to write your answers on a clean sheet of paper. Let's check your answers. Letter A, square root of 2 is between 1 and 2. Letter B, square root of 7 is between 2 and 3. Letter C, square root of 28 is between 5 and 6. Letter D, square root of 150 is between 12 and 13. And letter E, square root of 41 is between 6 and 7. I hope you did great in answering the activity because it will help you understand our second lesson for this day a lot easier. In plotting irrational numbers on a number line, we estimate first the square root of the given irrational number and to which two consecutive integers it lies in between. But before that, let's recall of what a number line is and what does it look like. A number line is a straight line with numbers placed at equal intervals or segments along its length. It can be extended infinitely in any direction and is usually represented horizontally. numbers from 0 going to the right direction are positive numbers, while from 0 going to the left direction are negative numbers.
In your previous activity, you determined two consecutive integers between which the given square roots lie. And now, we will apply that knowledge in this lesson. For example, letter A, locate and plot square root of 3 on a number line. Since ang 3 ay hindi perfect square, hahanap tayo ng dalawang perfect square number na pinakamalapit kay 3. And these are 1 and 4. Thus, square root of 3 lies between square root of 1 and square root of 4. And since 3 is closer to 4, we will then plot square root of 3 somewhere closer to 2, which is the principal root of square root of 4. For example, letter B, locate and plot square root of 21 on a number line. Since ang 21 ay hindi perfect square, hahanap tayo ng dalawang perfect square number na pinakamalapit kay 21. And these are 16 and 25. Thus, square root of 21 lies between square root of 16 and square root of 25. And since 21 is closer to 25, we will then plot square root of 21 somewhere closer to 5, which is the principal root of square root of 25. And for our last example, locate and plot square root of 87 on a number line. Since ang 87 ay hindi perfect square, hahanap tayo ng dalawang perfect square number na pinakamalapit kay 87. And these are 81 and 100. Thus, square root of 87 lies between square root of 81 and square root of 100. And since 87 is closer to 81, we will then plot square root of 87 somewhere closer to 9, which is the principal root of square root of 81.
You did great in watching and listening. Now, you can confidently answer the following activities on your module. These are what's more on page 17, what I have learned on page 18, and what I can do on page 18.
That ends our lesson today. We hope you learned something. See you on our next episode, Ka-Acute Angels.